I returned from Iraq after 18 months of deployment. My father said, "We were told you died in that bombing." I stood in the doorway of my childhood home with my duffel bag still slung over my shoulder, processing what my father had just said. The words hung in the air between us like smoke from an explosion, thick and impossible to see through clearly. Behind him, I could see my mother frozen at the kitchen table, her coffee cup halfway to her lips, her face drained of color in a way that had nothing to do with surprise or joy. My younger sister Bethany was standing at the bottom of the stairs, her phone clutched in her hand, and the expression on her face wasn't relief or happiness at seeing her brother alive. It was something closer to horror, or maybe calculation. Like she was doing math in her head, and the numbers weren't adding up the way she needed them to. My father, Gordon, was a big man who'd worked construction his entire adult life, and he filled the doorway with his bulk in a way that seemed almost defensive, like he was blocking entry rather than welcoming me home. His hands were shaking slightly as he gestured at me, pointing like I was an apparition he couldn't quite believe was real. He repeated it again, slower this time, enunciating each word with deliberate care. "We were told you died in that bombing 3 months ago. The Army sent us notification. We had a memorial service. Your mother collected the death benefits." The way he said it made it sound like an accusation, like I'd done something wrong by surviving, like my continued existence was an inconvenience that needed explaining. I set my duffel bag down on the porch and pulled out my phone, scrolling to my email where I'd received confirmation of my homecoming orders dated 6 weeks ago. I'd sent multiple messages to my family through Facebook and email, letting them know I was coming home, giving them the exact date and approximate time my flight would arrive. None of them had responded, which I'd chalked up to them being busy or maybe planning some kind of surprise welcome home party. Now I realized the silence had meant something entirely different. I showed my father the email, but he barely glanced at it before his eyes shifted back to my face with an expression I couldn't quite identify. Something between anger and fear, desperation and resentment all mixed together into something ugly. My mother finally stood up from the table, her chair scraping against the linoleum floor with a sound that seemed too loud in the strange silence. She walked toward me slowly, like she was approaching a wild animal that might bolt or attack without warning. When she reached me, she touched my arm tentatively, her fingers cold even through my uniform sleeve. Her voice came out in a whisper that I had to lean forward to hear properly. "They said you were in a vehicle that got hit by an IED outside Fallujah. They said there were no survivors. The casualty assistance officer came to our house and showed us the paperwork." She pulled away from me and wrapped her arms around herself, and I noticed she was wearing new jewelry, expensive-looking pieces I'd never seen before, a diamond bracelet and matching earrings that caught the afternoon light coming through the kitchen window. Bethany finally spoke up from her position by the stairs, her voice tight and controlled in a way that reminded me of how she used to sound when she was lying to our parents about where she'd been or what she'd done. "There must have been some mistake with the records," she said, looking at her phone screen rather than at me. "Some kind of administrative error with the casualty reports. It happens all the time with the military. They probably mixed up your name with someone else who actually died." The way she emphasized actually made my stomach turn, like she was suggesting I should have been the one who died instead of whoever really got killed in that bombing. I asked her what she meant by that, and she just shrugged and said nothing, but her eyes told a different story, one I was starting to piece together with growing unease. I picked up my duffel bag and pushed past my father into the house, needing to sit down because my legs suddenly felt unsteady beneath me. 18 months of deployment had taken a toll on my body, and I'd been looking forward to collapsing on my old bed and sleeping for about 3 days straight, letting the tension drain out of my shoulders and the nightmares fade into something manageable. Instead, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table where I'd eaten thousands of meals growing up, feeling like a stranger in a place that should have been safe and familiar. My mother brought me a glass of water without being asked, and I noticed her hands were shaking badly enough that some of it slopped over the rim and onto the table. She didn't meet my eyes when she set it down in front of me. My father stayed in the doorway, his massive frame blocking most of the afternoon light, turning the kitchen dim and cave-like. He pulled out his phone and made a call, speaking in low tones I couldn't quite make out, but I caught fragments that made my unease deepen into something closer to dread. He mentioned my name, said something about a situation that needed handling, asked when someone could come over to verify something. When he hung up, he looked at me with an expression that might have been pity, or might have been something darker, and he told me we needed to wait for someone from the Army to come and straighten this out. He made it sound like I was the problem that needed fixing, not whatever bureaucratic nightmare had declared me dead when I was very much alive. I asked my mother about the death benefits she'd mentioned, and she went pale again, her hand flying to her throat, where a new gold necklace sat heavy against her collarbone. She stuttered something about it being held in trust, about not having touched it yet, but her eyes darted to my father in a way that screamed dishonesty. Bethany cut in quickly, saying they'd used some of it for the memorial service, which had been expensive because they'd wanted to honor my sacrifice properly. She described the service in detail, the flowers and the catering and the reception afterward at the VFW hall, and with each detail the sum in my head grew larger and more impossible to believe. A memorial service for a fallen soldier didn't cost $30,000 unless someone was padding the numbers or outright lying. I stood up and walked through the house, noting changes that seemed too significant for just 18 months of my absence. New furniture in the living room, expensive leather pieces that still had tags tucked into the cushions, a flat-screen television that was at least 70 inches, mounted on the wall where my grandfather's old portrait used to hang. Through the window, I could see a new truck in the driveway, a Ford F-250 with all the bells and whistles, the kind my father had always wanted but never been able to afford on his construction wages. The picture was becoming clearer and uglier with each observation, like developing film in a dark room and watching the image emerge from nothing into something you wish you'd never seen. My mother followed me through the house, wringing her hands and offering explanations that sounded rehearsed and hollow. The furniture had been on sale. The television was a gift from my father's brother. The truck was used, bought from a friend who'd given them a good deal. Each lie was more transparent than the last, and I could see Bethany behind her, shaking her head slightly like she was trying to warn our mother to stop talking, to stop making it worse. I asked directly how much money they'd received from the army after my supposed death, and my mother's face crumpled like I'd hit her. She mumbled something about $50,000, but Bethany corrected her sharply, saying it was $400,000 from the SGLI policy, the standard life insurance payout for service members. $400,000. The number sat in the room like a bomb waiting to go off, ticking down toward an explosion none of us could stop. I did the math in my head, looking around at the new purchases, calculating rough values and coming up with a total that was nowhere near the full amount. I asked where the rest of the money was, and my father finally moved from his position in the doorway, crossing the kitchen in 3 long strides to get in my face. His voice was low and dangerous, the tone he used to use when I was a kid, and he was about to lose his temper. He told me the money was none of my business, that it had been paid to them as his survivors, that I should be grateful they were even letting me in the house after showing up unannounced and alive when everyone thought I was dead. The front door opened, and a man in uniform walked in without knocking, a major I didn't recognize wearing a casualty assistance officer badge. My father must have called him when I first arrived, must have immediately gone into damage control mode instead of celebrating that his son had survived a war. The major introduced himself as Philip Granger and asked to see my military ID, which I handed over while explaining that I'd been deployed for 18 months with the 3rd Infantry Division and had just returned stateside yesterday. I'd flown from Kuwait to Germany to Atlanta to finally Raleigh, and I'd taken a bus from Raleigh to this small North Carolina town where I'd grown up, where I'd enlisted from, where I thought I had a family waiting for me. Major Granger examined my ID carefully, then pulled out his phone and made several calls, speaking military jargon that my family couldn't follow, but that I understood perfectly. He was verifying my status, checking with my unit, confirming that I was who I claimed to be, and that I was legitimately alive, despite what their records showed. The calls took 20 minutes, during which my family stood around the kitchen in awkward silence, and I noticed they were all avoiding looking at each other, like conspirators who'd been caught, but hadn't decided yet whether to maintain the lie or come clean. When Major Granger finally hung up, his expression was troubled and confused in equal measure. He confirmed that I was indeed alive, and had been serving continuously for the past 18 months without interruption, which meant someone had made a catastrophic error in filing casualty reports. He explained that 3 months ago there had been an IED attack outside Fallujah that killed 4 soldiers in a convoy, but none of their names matched mine. Somehow, my name had been added to the casualty list through what appeared to be either gross incompetence or deliberate fraud, and the Army had notified my family of my death based on that erroneous information. The death benefits had been paid out according to standard procedure, processed and delivered within 6 weeks of the notification. But now that I was clearly alive, those benefits would need to be returned immediately, with possible interest and penalties depending on how the situation was investigated. My mother made a sound like a wounded animal and sank into a chair, her face buried in her hands. My father's expression went from defensive to something approaching panic, and he started talking fast, explaining that they'd acted in good faith, that they'd believed the notification was legitimate, that they'd used the money for necessary expenses, and to honor my memory. Major Granger held up a hand to stop him and said that the source of the error would need to be investigated, but in the meantime, the family needed to prepare to return the full amount of the death benefit, which was $400,000 plus any accrued interest. He said the Army would likely file a claim to recover the funds, and if the money had been spent, there could be serious legal consequences, including fraud charges. Bethany's phone rang and she answered it quickly, walking into the other room for privacy. I could hear her voice rising in pitch, stressed and frightened, talking to someone about needing to cancel something or return something. When she came back, she looked like she might cry, and she glared at me with pure venom in her eyes. She said I'd ruined everything, that I should have stayed dead, that my coming back alive was going to destroy the whole family. My father told her to shut up, but the damage was done, the truth hanging in the air like cordite smoke. They'd spent the money. They'd spent my death benefit knowing I was alive, or at least strongly suspecting I was alive, and now they were going to face consequences for it. I asked Major Granger what he meant by deliberate fraud, and he explained that sometimes family members would file false casualty reports to collect death benefits, though it was rare and extremely risky given how thoroughly the Army verified such things. He said the investigation would look at the timeline of events, examining when the casualty report was filed and by whom, checking whether anyone in my chain of command or anyone with access to personnel records might have been involved. His eyes kept drifting to my father as he spoke, and I saw something click in my own understanding. My father had a cousin who worked in personnel at Fort Bragg, a staff sergeant named Dennis, who'd helped me process my enlistment paperwork 4 years ago. I'd mentioned Dennis to my father in emails during my deployment, casual references about running into him when I'd passed through Bragg on my way overseas. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my sent emails, looking for the messages I'd sent to my family over the past 18 months. I found dozens of them, detailed accounts of my deployment, descriptions of missions I could discuss without violating operational security, complaints about the food and the heat and the boredom between patrols. Every single one had been read, the read receipts showing they'd been opened within hours of me sending them. My family had known I was alive the entire time. They'd followed my deployment through my emails, and then 3 months ago, the emails had stopped being opened. The last one I'd sent had been right before a 2-week communications blackout when my unit went on a sensitive operation. When we'd come back online, I'd sent another email, but that one showed as unread, as did every subsequent message. I showed Major Granger the email history, and his expression darkened considerably. He took photos of my phone screen with his own device, documenting the evidence that my family had been receiving regular updates about my status right up until the time they'd reported me dead. He asked my father directly if he'd known I was alive when he filed the casualty report, and my father started to answer, but my mother cut him off, her voice high and desperate. She said it had been a misunderstanding, that they'd panicked when they hadn't heard from me for several weeks, that Dennis had offered to check the casualty lists and had somehow gotten confused. But that explanation didn't hold water, because civilian family members couldn't just file casualty reports. That had to come through official military channels, which meant Dennis had been involved somehow, had either made an honest mistake or had been part of a deliberate scheme. Major Granger made another call, this time to someone at Fort Bragg, and I heard him mention Dennis by name and rank. The conversation was brief and tense, and when he hung up, he told us that Dennis was being detained for questioning, that there were serious irregularities in his access logs showing he'd pulled my personnel file multiple times in the weeks before the false casualty report was filed. He explained that military death benefits fraud was a federal crime carrying penalties of up to 10 years in prison and substantial fines. If Dennis had deliberately filed a false report to help my family collect benefits, he'd be facing a court-martial and federal prosecution. My father would face criminal charges as a co-conspirator, and anyone else who'd knowingly participated or benefited from the fraud could be charged as well. My mother stood up abruptly and announced she was calling a lawyer, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold her phone. My father tried to stop her, saying that would make them look guilty, but she ignored him and walked outside to make the call in private. Through the window, I could see her pacing back and forth on the front lawn, gesturing wildly as she spoke to whoever was on the other end. Bethany sat down on the couch and started crying, real tears this time, and she looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time. She asked quietly if I was going to press charges against them, and I realized I hadn't even thought that far ahead yet. I'd been so focused on understanding what had happened that I hadn't considered what I wanted to do about it. Major Granger gave me his card and told me to expect follow-up contact from CID, the Army's Criminal Investigation Division, within the next few days. He said I should document everything I could remember about my communications with my family during deployment, gather any evidence that showed they knew I was alive, and prepare to give formal statements. He looked at my father with undisguised contempt and said that making a false casualty report wasn't just fraud, it was an insult to every service member who'd actually given their lives, and to their families who'd suffered real loss. Then he left, and the house felt smaller and colder without his official presence, like we'd all been exposed to something we couldn't take back or pretend hadn't happened. I grabbed my duffel bag and stood up to leave, not wanting to spend another minute in that house with people who'd literally tried to profit from my death. My father blocked the doorway again, and his expression had shifted to something closer to desperation than anger. He said we needed to talk about this as a family, that we could figure something out, that maybe if I just went along with having been confused about the timeline or the communications, they could claim it was all an honest mistake. He was asking me to lie for them, to help cover up their fraud, to sacrifice my integrity so they could keep money they'd stolen by pretending I was dead. The absolute gall of it took my breath away, and I shoved past him hard enough that he stumbled backward into the doorframe. Outside, the late afternoon sun was too bright after the dimness of the house, and I stood on the porch trying to decide where to go. I didn't have a car, had sold mine before deployment, and used the money to pay off credit cards. I had about $3,000 in my bank account from deployment pay that I'd been saving, but everything else I owned was in the duffel bag on my shoulder. My phone rang, and I saw it was my old friend Trevor, another guy from town who'd enlisted the same time I did, but had gone into the Navy instead of the Army. I answered and heard his voice loud and excited, saying he'd heard I was back in town and asking if I wanted to meet up for drinks. I told him yes immediately, grateful for literally any excuse to get away from my family. Trevor picked me up 20 minutes later in his beat-up Civic, and the normalcy of seeing his grinning face and getting a proper welcome home made me want to cry. He drove us to a bar on the edge of town, a dive place that catered to military folks and veterans, and we grabbed a booth in the back where we could talk without shouting over the jukebox. I told him everything that had happened since I'd walked through my parents' door, and his expression went from shocked to furious to something like understanding as I laid out the whole sordid story. He asked the same question Bethany had asked, whether I was going to press charges, and I still didn't have an answer. They were my family, despite everything, and the thought of my father going to prison made me feel sick, even though part of me thought he deserved it. Trevor pulled out his phone and showed me something that made the situation even more complicated. It was a Facebook post from 3 months ago, right around the time the false casualty report had been filed, showing my sister Bethany at some kind of party. The caption read, "Celebrating new beginnings and fresh starts," and she was posing with a guy I didn't recognize, his arm around her waist, both of them holding champagne glasses. Trevor scrolled through more photos, showing a timeline of posts from my family members over the past 3 months. My mother at a spa resort in the mountains, posting about self-care and healing. My father on a golf course at some expensive country club, bragging about his new membership. Bethany herself had posted dozens of photos showing a lifestyle way beyond what my family could normally afford. Designer clothes and fancy restaurants and concert tickets. They'd been living it up on my death benefit while I was still deployed, still in danger, still thinking they were my family who cared whether I lived or died. The betrayal cut deeper than anything I'd experienced in Iraq, worse than the fear during firefights or the grief when we lost people from our unit. This was intimate and personal in a way that combat never was, a violation of trust that went to the core of who I thought I was and where I came from. Trevor must have seen something in my face because he reached across the table and gripped my shoulder hard, the same way he used to do when we were kids, and I was upset about something. He said I didn't owe them anything, that blood didn't mean shit when people betrayed you like this, that I should let the army throw the book at them and not feel guilty about it. My phone started buzzing with texts, first from my mother, then from Bethany, both of them begging me to come back to the house so we could talk as a family. My father sent a text that was less apologetic and more threatening, saying I'd better think carefully about what I was doing, that accusing my own family of fraud would have consequences I might not be prepared for. I showed the messages to Trevor, and he suggested I forward them all to Major Granger, that they could be evidence of witness intimidation or attempting to influence my statement. I did that immediately, feeling a small surge of satisfaction as I hit send, documenting their attempts to manipulate me into silence. I spent that night on Trevor's couch, sleeping poorly and dreaming about explosions that morphed into my father's face, telling me I was dead. The next morning, I woke to find missed calls from a number with a Fort Bragg prefix, and when I called back, I reached CID agent Lorna Castellanos. She explained that she was the lead investigator on my case and needed me to come in for a formal interview as soon as possible. Trevor drove me to Bragg, which was about 90 minutes away, and I spent 4 hours in a small interview room going through every detail I could remember about my deployment and my communications with my family. Agent Castellanos was thorough and professional, recording everything and asking pointed questions that showed she already had a pretty good idea of what had happened. She showed me documents that Dennis had filed, the casualty notification forms with my name and service number, dated exactly 2 weeks after my last email to my family had been opened. Dennis had claimed he'd received information from a unit member that I'd been killed in an IED attack, but when CID interviewed my unit members, none of them had ever spoken to Dennis or had any reason to think I was dead. In fact, my squad leader had a log of every patrol I'd been on for the past 18 months, and I hadn't been anywhere near Fallujah when that actual IED attack had occurred. The evidence pointed to a deliberate fraud scheme, with Dennis filing false paperwork based on information provided by my father about when I'd be out of contact due to operational security. Agent Castellanos explained the timeline as they'd reconstructed it. My father had contacted Dennis 3 months ago, right when I'd gone on that communications blackout. He'd claimed he was worried because he hadn't heard from me, and he'd asked Dennis to check the casualty lists to make sure I was okay. Dennis, who apparently had financial problems of his own, including gambling debts, had seen an opportunity. He'd filed a false casualty report, knowing that the 2-week verification period would pass while I was still unable to communicate, and by the time I came back online and started sending emails again, my family had already been notified of my death, and the benefit process had begun. My father had likely told them to ignore my subsequent emails, to pretend they'd never received them, to maintain the fiction that I was dead long enough to collect the money. The investigation had also uncovered that my father had made several large cash deposits into his bank account in the weeks after receiving the death benefit, amounts that were just under the $10,000 reporting threshold that would trigger automatic scrutiny. He'd been deliberately structuring the deposits to avoid attention, which was itself a federal crime called smurfing. Dennis had received $30,000 in cash deposits around the same time, paid in multiple installments from multiple sources, making it harder to trace but not impossible with the kind of forensic accounting CID could do. The whole scheme was unraveling fast, and everyone involved was going to face serious consequences. I asked Agent Castellanos what would happen to my family, and she laid it out in blunt terms. My father would face federal charges for fraud, conspiracy, and structuring, carrying potential sentences of up to 20 years. Dennis would face a court-martial for making false official statements, fraud, and conduct unbecoming, likely resulting in a dishonorable discharge and federal prison time. My mother and Bethany were in a slightly different position because they could potentially claim they'd believed the casualty report was legitimate and hadn't known about the fraud. However, their social media activity and the fact that they'd ignored my emails after the supposed death notification made that defense weak. If the prosecution could prove they'd knowingly participated in or benefited from the scheme, they'd face conspiracy charges as well. Agent Castellanos asked me directly whether I wanted to pursue full prosecution or whether I'd prefer some kind of resolution that might be less harsh on my family members. It was the same question everyone kept asking me, and I still didn't have a clear answer. Part of me wanted them to face the full consequences of what they'd done, wanted them to understand that you couldn't just fake someone's death for money and walk away. But another part of me, the part that remembered my mother reading to me when I was sick as a kid, or my father teaching me how to throw a football, couldn't quite reconcile those memories with the people who'd stolen from me. I told Agent Castellanos I needed time to think about it, and she said that was fair, but to keep in mind that the federal charges were going forward regardless of my wishes, because fraud against the military was taken extremely seriously. Trevor drove me back to his place, and I spent the next few days in a haze, trying to process everything while fielding calls and texts from family members who alternated between apologetic and hostile. My mother's lawyer reached out asking if I'd be willing to meet with them to discuss a possible resolution, but I ignored that message on the advice of the lawyer I'd retained, a former JAG officer who specialized in military cases. My father stopped texting altogether after his lawyer presumably told him to shut up, but Bethany kept sending me long, rambling messages about how this was all going to destroy the family, how I was being selfish, how I should think about Mom who was fragile and might not survive going to prison. The guilt was effective because it was designed to be, hitting exactly the pressure points my family had been exploiting my entire life. I'd always been the responsible one, the one who took care of things, the one who put family first, even when it cost me. Joining the Army had been partially about proving I could provide for them, about making enough money to help pay off their debts, and maybe buy my mother a decent car. The irony that my death benefit would have accomplished those goals in a twisted way wasn't lost on me, but there was a difference between helping family and being victimized by them, and I had to keep reminding myself that they'd literally celebrated my supposed death while spending the money that came from it. 2 weeks after I'd returned home, I got called back to Fort Bragg for a formal proceeding. Dennis's court-martial had been scheduled, and I'd been subpoenaed as a witness to testify about my communications with my family and my knowledge of his access to personnel records. The courtroom was small and sterile, filled with uniformed officers and legal personnel who all seemed to know exactly why they were there. Dennis sat at the defense table looking smaller than I remembered him, his uniform immaculate but his face haggard and gray. When our eyes met, he looked away quickly, unable to hold my gaze for more than a second. His lawyer tried to argue that Dennis had made an honest mistake, that he genuinely believed I'd been killed based on miscommunication with my father, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. I testified for about an hour, walking through the timeline of events and confirming that I'd never been near Fallujah, that I'd continued sending emails to my family even after the supposed casualty report, that Dennis would have had access to my actual status through personnel systems if he'd bothered to check. The prosecutor asked me directly if I believed Dennis had filed the false report, knowing I was alive, and I said yes, based on the evidence I'd seen. The judge asked me how this had affected me personally, and I found myself struggling to articulate the betrayal, the way it had poisoned my homecoming and made me question every relationship I had. I told him it felt like dying in a different way, having your family kill the version of you they'd loved and replace it with a corpse they could profit from. The court-martial took 2 days, and Dennis was found guilty on all counts. The sentence was harsh, a dishonorable discharge, 5 years in federal prison, and full restitution of the $30,000 he'd received plus penalties. His military career was over, his benefits gone, his future destroyed by his decision to help my father commit fraud. I felt a complicated mix of satisfaction and sadness watching him being led away in handcuffs, knowing that his family would suffer for his choices the same way mine was suffering for my father's. But he'd made his decision knowing the consequences, had chosen money over integrity, and now he'd live with the results. My father's federal trial was scheduled for 3 months later, giving me time to decide how involved I wanted to be in the prosecution. The federal prosecutor, a sharp woman named Diane Okoye, met with me several times to prepare my testimony and to discuss the strength of the case. She explained that my father's defense would likely claim he'd panicked when he couldn't reach me, that he'd asked Dennis to check on my status out of genuine concern, and that things had spiraled out of his control before he could stop them. But the structured cash deposits undermined that defense, showing premeditation and awareness that what he was doing was illegal. The continued spending spree after receiving the benefit showed no remorse or intention to make things right. I attended the trial, sitting in the gallery and watching my father try to explain away his actions. He testified that he'd been devastated by the news of my death, that the money had been some small comfort in his grief, that he'd used it to honor my memory by finally buying the things he'd always wanted to provide for the family. His lawyer painted him as a grieving father who'd made poor financial decisions while in shock, not a calculating fraudster who'd conspired to fake his son's death. But the prosecutor systematically destroyed that narrative, showing the Facebook posts of him celebrating at the country club, playing the voicemails where he'd discussed the money with Dennis before the casualty report was ever filed, showing bank records that proved he'd started planning the structured deposits before he'd even received the benefit. My mother took the stand and cried convincingly, claiming she'd believed I was really dead, that she'd been in such emotional turmoil she hadn't noticed my emails in her inbox after the notification. The prosecutor showed her the read receipts proving she'd opened and read several of my emails sent after the supposed death, then showed her screenshots from her phone where she'd discussed those emails with Bethany, with both of them agreeing to pretend they'd never received them. My mother's credibility collapsed in real time, and I watched her lawyer frantically try to salvage her testimony, but the damage was done. She'd knowingly participated in the fraud, had actively helped maintain the fiction of my death while enjoying the benefits that came with it. Bethany cut a deal with the prosecutors, agreeing to testify against our parents in exchange for immunity. She took the stand and described how our father had brought her and our mother into the plan after Dennis had filed the casualty report, explaining that they needed to maintain the appearance that I was dead long enough to collect and spend the money. She described meetings where they'd discussed how to avoid getting caught, how to explain away my emails if anyone asked, how to make sure they spent the money quickly enough that it would be harder to recover even if the fraud was discovered. She cried while testifying, but I wasn't sure if the tears were genuine remorse or just another performance designed to save her own skin. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning guilty verdicts on all counts for my father and most counts for my mother. My father was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution of the $400,000 plus interest and penalties, which he clearly couldn't do, given that the money was gone. My mother received 5 years, with 3 suspended, meaning she'd serve 2 years, followed by probation. The judge's statement at sentencing was scathing, saying that their actions had violated not just federal law but the basic bonds of family trust, that they'd celebrated their son's supposed death while he was still in harm's way serving his country, and that their greed had dishonored every military family who'd experienced real loss. I left the courthouse feeling empty rather than vindicated, watching my parents being led away to begin their sentences. Trevor was waiting outside, and we drove back to his place in silence because there wasn't really anything to say. I'd gotten justice in the legal sense, but it felt hollow and incomplete, like winning a fight by forfeit rather than actually resolving anything. My family was destroyed, scattered to different prisons and probation conditions, and I was left trying to figure out what came next for me. The Army had assigned me to a unit at Bragg while they processed everything, but my enlistment was up in 6 months, and I couldn't decide if I wanted to re-enlist or separate and try to build a civilian life. The Army eventually recovered about $50,000 from selling off the assets my family had purchased with the death benefit, but the rest was gone, spent on experiences and consumables that couldn't be repossessed. The remaining $350,000 was written off as a loss, and I received a formal apology from the Secretary of the Army along with an investigation into how such a catastrophic error could occur in the casualty notification system. The investigation found multiple points of failure, from Dennis's ability to file false reports to the lack of verification with unit commanders before notifying families. Recommendations were made to tighten procedures, to add multiple redundancy checks, to make it harder for someone to exploit the system the way Dennis and my father had. I used my savings to put a down payment on a small apartment near Bragg, filling it with secondhand furniture and trying to create something that felt like home. Trevor helped me move in, and he brought his girlfriend Shanice, who worked as a counselor at the VA, and who quietly suggested I might want to talk to someone about the trauma of what I'd experienced. I bristled at first because I'd been trained to think that admitting you needed help was weakness, but eventually I made an appointment with a therapist who specialized in military families and betrayal trauma. The sessions were harder than combat had been in some ways, forcing me to confront feelings I'd been pushing down for months, but they helped me start to process what had happened and figure out who I was without my family. Bethany reached out about 6 months after the trials, asking if we could meet for coffee. I ignored the first few messages but eventually agreed, curious about what she wanted and whether she'd actually changed or was just looking for something. We met at a chain restaurant halfway between Bragg and where she was living with friends, and she looked different, smaller somehow, like the weight of everything had compressed her into a lesser version of herself. She apologized for her part in the fraud, said she'd been stupid and greedy and caught up in the excitement of suddenly having money. She admitted she'd known it was wrong, but had convinced herself it wasn't really hurting anyone since I was supposed to be dead anyway. The logic was twisted, but I understood it. Recognized it as the kind of rationalization people use when they want to do something they know is wrong. I asked her what she wanted from me, and she said honestly she didn't know, that she just needed me to know she was sorry and that she understood if I never wanted to see her again. She told me our mother was struggling in prison, that she'd lost a lot of weight and was having mental health issues that the prison wasn't properly treating. Our father, by contrast, had apparently found religion and was thriving in a prison ministry program, which made a kind of sense because he'd always been good at performing whatever role would benefit him most. Bethany said she'd testified against them because she'd been scared and hadn't wanted to go to prison herself, not because she'd suddenly developed a conscience. At least she was being honest about it. I told Bethany I couldn't forgive what she'd done. Not yet, and maybe not ever, but that I appreciated her apology and her honesty. I said I needed time and space to figure out who I was going to be, now that my family wasn't part of my life in any meaningful way. She cried and said she understood, and we parted with an awkward hug that felt more like obligation than affection. I drove back to my apartment and sat in the parking lot for a long time, watching the sun set and thinking about all the different ways a person could die without their body actually stopping. My family had killed the version of me that trusted easily, that put family first, that believed blood meant something permanent and unbreakable. But maybe that wasn't entirely a bad thing. Maybe I'd needed to die in that way to become someone stronger, someone who chose his family rather than just accepting the one he was born into. 3 years later, I was working as a logistics coordinator for a defense contractor, using the skills I'd learned in the Army to manage supply chains and coordinate shipments. I'd finished my bachelor's degree online using my GI Bill benefits, and I was dating a woman named Kelsey, who worked as a paralegal and who knew my whole story without judging me for it. Trevor and Shanice had gotten married and had a kid, and I was the godfather, which felt like a family role I'd actually chosen and earned. My father was still in prison with 7 years left on his sentence, and my mother had been released after serving her time and was living with her sister in Florida. We exchanged emails occasionally, surface-level updates about weather and health, but the relationship was permanently altered, performative rather than genuine. Bethany had moved to Colorado and was working at a ski resort, trying to build a life far away from the wreckage of what our family had been. She sent me Christmas cards every year with long notes about what she was doing and how she was working on being a better person. I read them, but rarely responded, not out of cruelty, but because I genuinely didn't know what to say to her. The wound had scarred over, but it was still tender, still capable of causing pain if prodded too hard. Maybe someday we'd rebuild something resembling a sibling relationship, but for now, the distance felt necessary and appropriate. The Army had processed the casualty notification error as a closed case, with recommendations implemented and procedures tightened. Dennis had served 3 years of his sentence before being released on good behavior, and last I heard he was working construction in Texas, trying to rebuild his life without military benefits or prospects. Part of me felt sorry for him because he'd destroyed his entire future for $30,000, but another part of me remembered that he'd had every opportunity to do the right thing and had chosen not to. We all make choices that define who we become, and Dennis had chosen to be someone who'd fake a soldier's death for money. I thought sometimes about the soldier who'd actually died in that IED attack outside Fallujah, the one whose death had been real while mine was fiction. I'd learned his name was Corporal Isaiah Brennan, and he'd been 23 years old with a wife and a baby daughter he'd never met. His family's grief had been authentic while mine had been performative, and that felt like an injustice that couldn't be corrected through any legal process. I donated money to a scholarship fund in his name, a small gesture that couldn't bring him back, but that at least acknowledged his sacrifice was real and meaningful in ways my supposed death never had been. On the anniversary of the day I'd come home to find my family celebrating my death, I drove out to a veterans cemetery where several of my deployed friends were buried. I walked among the white headstones, reading names and dates, thinking about how many families had suffered real losses while mine had manufactured one for profit. I placed flowers on Isaiah Brennan's grave, even though we'd never served together, and he'd never known me. It felt important to honor his actual death, to make sure someone remembered that when people talked about casualty fraud and administrative errors, there was a real soldier behind those abstract terms, a real life that had ended while mine continued. I returned from Iraq after 18 months of deployment and learned that some betrayals are worse than any enemy fire, that you can survive war only to be killed by the people who were supposed to love you. But I also learned that you can build new families from the wreckage of old ones, that chosen bonds can be stronger than blood, and that surviving means more than just keeping your body alive. It means deciding who you're going to be in the aftermath of being destroyed and rebuilt, and making that person someone you can live with. 6 years after walking through my parents' door expecting a homecoming and finding a crime scene, I finally felt like I'd completed my real deployment, the one that started when I returned from war and discovered I'd have to fight a different kind of battle entirely.